Hey folks. Okay, this video might be displeasing to some people in the targeted community, and please understand, I mean no offense. I mean no offense. We all have to stand together, regardless of our differences in political views and religion and whatever else that is used to divide people and separate us. But earlier today, I was thinking about what I was before the targeting started. I was a patriotic American. I was a human rights activist. And I spoke out about these things. I spoke out against human rights abuses. I spoke out against abuses of, if I saw, you know, if I saw actions that were possibly counterproductive to a free nation, to our Constitution. All of that has had to take a back seat to the organized stalking. All of my focus, my time, my energy has been on first of all, defending myself against, this psyop, this Zersetzung style, COINTEL style psyop waged against me and so many others, and finally speaking out against it. And we all should be speaking out against this program. We all should be getting our stories out there and letting people know what's happening. But I think in part two, this is meant to divert our attention, our energy, our time, and our resources from other issues onto this, so that we no longer have time to speak out as a human rights activist or as a patriot, against a constitutional crisis, if there ever is one. And right now it appears that there is one, which is why I'm speaking out now. I apologize if this video offends anyone, but this has to be done. That said, and I just wrote down what I had to say, so I'm just going to read what I wrote. While my loyalty is to the United States as a whole, this most urgent plea is for the state of Illinois, with emphasis on Chicago. Though later in this video, I address the entire nation. On the evening of May 30th, 2020, a curfew was put in place for the city of Chicago, at which time the protesters were given extremely short notice to get off the streets and get home. This resulted in many of them being stuck outside past curfew in a situation where such an act, that is, being outside past curfew, could result in their arrest and imprisonment. Many ended up being trapped downtown, blocked by the police from leaving, and finally arrested for being out past curfew. This was a setup. This was entrapment. And it's something that should never be allowed in the United States of America. But if this is the turn our nation is taking, I must now make a request to Governor Pritzker and Mayor Lightfoot that you both do whatever you can to ensure that the peaceful protesters who were set up and entrapped are released from police custody and that all charges against them are dropped. And finally, I implore you to stand against what is quickly becoming a fascist takeover of the United States of America. Please do not cooperate with those who seek to implement a dictatorship, and do not allow Chicago, and preferably the entire state of Illinois, to fall under total martial law and ultimately become a police state. When would-be dictators seek to take over, there are a few prerequisites they must carry out in order to succeed. They usually take the following actions. So let's see, number one, silencing dissidents, making it hard or impossible for opposition, aka patriots, whistleblowers, and human rights activists, to speak out in defense of their freedom and their nation. This is typically achieved by, first and foremost, taking away the right of all citizens to hold peaceful protests, or even to openly oppose the would-be dictator. In many cases, peaceful protesters and dissidents in general are labeled enemies of the state, or in today's climate, terrorists. And while there are always going to be some troublemakers, some infiltrators, a certain element whose only intent is to create chaos, the damage done is blamed not on the actual perpetrators, but instead on peaceful protesters who had nothing to do with the crimes committed. Next, They'll also shut down social media or any news outlet that is unfavorable to the would-be dictator. Okay, this is a strategy used by most dictators, right, the world over. Genuine news sources are then replaced with state TV that is used to promote the agenda and the propaganda of the would-be dictator. All right, let's see. Getting rid of professionals who are knowledgeable in their field and skilled at their job, and replacing them with one's own cronies. This is what dictators do, or would-be dictators do. This also involves the firing of honest, hard-working, well-skilled government employees and replacing them with lackeys to the would-be dictator. Next, turning a blind eye when the police use physical force, including beating, tasing, and gassing, which has been happening around America lately, against peaceful, unarmed protesters, or worse, ordering the police to do so. Also lumping in peaceful, unarmed protesters with violent agitators, and thus attacking them altogether. Next, turning the nation's military into one's own personal army and sending active troops out to police the citizens, in some cases ordering troops to use physical force against citizens who protest, in some cases ordering troops to use physical force against citizens who protest against or even so much as show opposition to the mandates of the would-be leader or the would-be dictator. Next, creating a secret police force whose loyalty is not to the nation, but instead to the would-be dictator. Incidentally, who are those unidentified, armed federal troops people have been seeing policing DC streets, military style? They're dressed like combatants, but have no identification. Attempting to hinder or completely cease democratic elections. Okay, there's always going to be some excuse. They might not come out and say that they want to stop the elections, but there's going to be some kind of excuse they use to call off the elections or to make it difficult for certain individuals to vote or certain groups to vote. These actions are only a few of the methods used in order to crush democracy and implement a fascist dictatorship. The Trump administration has done, or at least has threatened to do, all of these things and more, and I can no longer remain silent on this matter. In order to avoid alienating targets who might have different political views, I try to avoid taking political sides on this channel. But the situation in the United States has devolved to such an extent that to remain silent is an evil in and of itself. And I think at this point, people from both sides, both Democrat and Republican, understand this. For once, we all need to stand together for the sake of our nation. If we can't stand together, we will fall together. Let us no longer be a nation divided, but a nation united. Even if the only thing we have in common is a love of our country, then let that be the motive for a new alliance, a new resistance. Standing against fascists and would-be dictators is never easy. But if not for the resistance, the brave men and women from all generations who fought against such things, the concept of freedom would have been banished from human consciousness a long time ago. Due to my current situation as a target of Zersetzung, what we nowadays call organized stalking or gang stalking, it is hard to get out, join groups, form alliances with like-minded individuals, and take a more active role in the defense of our nation. Maybe that's the point of Zersetzung, to hinder the ability of patriots, whistleblowers, and human rights activists to join together against those who threaten the welfare of the nation. And I guarantee there are going to be infiltrators at those protests, organized stalkers, whose intent is only to target the peaceful protesters. I guarantee it. So a brief history of Zersetzung. During the communist takeover of East Germany, the Stasi, or the state police, waged a very specific type of attack against dissidents. This method of warfare was later termed Zersetzung, or decomposition. This includes setups, entrapment, illegal surveillance, smear campaigns, false accusations without giving the target a chance to defend himself or herself, infiltration into the target's personal life in order to destroy the target from within, attempts to recruit friends and family into the quote-unquote monitoring of the target who is wrongfully deemed a potential threat, attempts to provoke the target into a public outburst or other negative response only to report the target for that response, and of course, attempts to set the target up for a false mental illness diagnosis. Methods used to drive the target insane or to simply force him or her to speak out about what was happening, only to have the target labeled with mental illness when he reports the crimes, included following the target wherever he went, making it known to him that he was being followed, but never informing him of why or who was behind the campaign against him, illegally entering the target's home and moving things around or leaving a window open so that he would know that even his home was being invaded, and thus there was no safe shelter. Having random people make very specific comments to or around the target, oftentimes referencing an aspect of the target's personal life or something that the target said or did in private. These conversations are meant to seem ordinary and harmless to bystanders, so that if the target becomes upset, he is the one who seems irrational. And again, this is meant to show the target that he's being watched and listened to 24/7, even in private, okay? It's meant to create paranoia, okay? Discomfort, dis-ease, fear, confusion, psychosis. Setting the target up for one mishap after another, or simply causing the target more trouble than is necessary in as many situations as possible. Okay, extreme gaslighting. Numerous other methods of psychological warfare were used. The purpose was twofold. First, to force the targets to speak out about what was happening. Since the tactics used against the targets were far too unbelievable to be taken seriously, the targets were in this manner set up for a false mental health diagnosis when they complained. Finally, in almost all cases, this method of warfare really did drive the targets insane, clinically, to a total or near total psychological breakdown. Victims of this type of attack often ended up being institutionalized, and even if they were allowed to remain in society, they were completely discredited, having lost whatever influence they might have had over the people, and thus were no longer seen as a threat to the current rulers. This type of warfare has been waged on the American people for decades. In fact, the FBI conducted a similar type of attack on civil rights activists. Moreover, the step-by-step destruction of our freedom and our nation has been taking place for years. Remember, it was former President Bush who signed the wrongfully named Patriot Act into existence, and neither former President Obama nor current President Trump have terminated it. Though former President Obama might have changed the name, the substance remains the same. Right? It still pretty much annihilates our Constitution. And ironically, for me and a lot of other targeted individuals, it's around that time when, after Bush signed the Patriot Act, that our targeting began. Some a little earlier, some a little later, some maybe a few years later, but around that time, within a few years. My point is that this did not start with Trump. He, like many other presidents, is a puppet. And it appears as if his purpose is to implement the final stages of this decades-long war against the American people. Dissidents have been targeted and silenced all along, but now the attempt to quash all dissent is being carried out overtly, using military-style tactics, and laws are even being changed to allow this, right? And this is being done along with the covert methods that are typical of Zersetzung-style attacks or COINTELPRO-style attacks. The destruction that we are witnessing today of our democracy and our freedom has most likely been planned for years, and this seems to be the final phase of this terminal nation-destroying illness. Does anyone still believe that the idea of a new world order was nothing more than a conspiracy theory conjured up in the diseased minds of paranoid delusionals? Honestly, anyone? It's time for America, all of America, regardless of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or political affiliation, to stand together as one nation, against those who seek to take from us the only thing that many of us have in common, our home.